Resilience, identity, platformization, agentic AI. They're all top of mind, and we explored them all here at Deloitte Cyberhouse. We hosted some of the brightest minds in the industry to make sense of today's momentous changes and opportunities, and to look at what's next in cybersecurity.
Greg, in the context of cybersecurity for space, sort of outside of the human element, what's keeping you up at night there? What's the hardest from your perspective?
I think the biggest thing we have is challenge we have is resilience. You know, we have systems that have been operating for 30 years or more, and we have systems that have been operating for 3 months or less. They were not designed, built to live in an ecosystem, no different than the terrestrial world was not designed in the original day for security either. And so I think, unfortunately, and this is typical, we tend to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And, you know, you look at one of the most vulnerable things we have in our society, because you asked, you know, right at the front end, you know, why is this important to any business or any individual? And that's, for those in the room that are familiar with the space world, this won't be a surprise, but to most people it is. We depend on everything from a communication perspective in life relies on GPS. If the GPS constellation in any form is degraded or taken out, your cell phone drifts within 6 seconds, it won't work. ATM machines won't work. Your car won't work, and on and on and on. So if you want to create havoc in society, and you really want to hurt the US economy and others, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, gas pumps, traffic lights, the simplest things that you don't realize are dependent on that timing signal coming from space, and lots of other things, right? The way we harvest our food, weather, a ton of things. I love what you said about resilience, and when I think about resilience, I think about that balance of protection versus, compromise. That, protection is really keeping the cost of compromise high to the adversary, while security is really keeping the cost of compromise low to the mission that you're trying to protect. And that is the balance. You have to assume that compromise is going to happen. So when it does, how do we maintain resiliency? How does the mission continue?
Well, it's far away. The difference is
That's right.
Someone compromises a server, you run in the back and unplug it. That's not very easy to do in space.
What approaches do you see organizations using to secure space that's far away? The satellite versus the link versus the ground.
So I think if we look at it, which is, again, we're mirroring what we did in the terrestrial world. So we have standards that are emerging to keep the industry and the end-to-end supply chain in sync. I guess that's the best way I would use it, so that people are all operating from the same sheet of paper. Two, we have the traditional, and I'll call traditional, we were talking earlier, IDSs and IPSs and EDRs and antivirus software and on and on and on. All of that is being deployed in space. The challenge that we face with that is power and bandwidth, because you don't have a massive computer up there. And with the advent of AI and what's going on, our adversaries in space are good. And they are moving at a pace that has no boundary, whereas we as a country have drawn boundaries. And it's always a conflict problem in anything. So we're seeing the move to systems, we're seeing the move to continuous end-to-end testing in a space, and monitoring. The Space ISAC does a portion of that. The information sharing organizations that sit out and abroad all over. It's not just, even the FS ISAC, different from the Space ISAC, still work together because that all ties back into that end-to-end system.
All right, so many organizations know that modernization is needed, but they haven't acted. And something that we hear about is the platforms not keeping pace. So Chris, why can't legacy identity platforms keep pace with today's risks and AI realities?
Yeah, and it really is on two different vectors. So one is all of these different identity types suddenly have different demands and have different ways they need to be managed, different policies and controls to be put in place, and it just a different life cycle. And if you think about a system that was designed even 5 or 10 years ago, it was largely focused on humans, right? And so those different identity types need those different use cases, and you could customize and do that at scale, but eventually identity teams run out of budget and bandwidth to do that. And so that's a huge driver. I think the kind of coupled with that is this trend we're seeing where in the past we would say, okay, you have all these accounts that maybe machines, or I guess they are agents now, maybe not in the past, but the idea of like, okay, we just kind of ignored those, right? And it's kind of crazy to think back, like, why did we think that was okay? But the big trend now is like every single account in the enterprise, we need to know, why is it there, right? Does it have the right access? Is it appropriate for what we're trying to do? Does it have an owner? How do I put all of those accounts and associate them with the right business processes? And that kind of scale, again, legacy systems just weren't designed to operate at that level. They were focused on 50 of the crown jewel applications, right? And that was what great looked like a few years ago. Today, we're seeing customers say, I want to onboard everything and I want to govern it and control it at the right level. Again, it's just, you need a different kind of tool to do that and to make that work. And if you do that the right way, identity teams spend all of their time on defining the right policies, giving the right access, getting towards that nirvana of least privilege, as opposed to fighting with the tool and managing, performance and scale and developing, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lines of code. So yeah, it's just I think the problems change so much, and we need a different approach than, what we were doing 10 years in the past.
Yeah. So just to, add on that, the same line of thought is that if you look at how the evolution of AI come in, just before the AI evolution/revolution, so to call, 2 years before it was zero trust. So I personally think that it's just a nature's way of saying it, that you embark on the zero trust principles and policies and the architecture that enables you to be stricter in terms of what you're doing from AI. So when you talk about modernization, right, it has to be looked at into 3 different lenses, which is what we traditionally use: technology, process, and controls. So from a technology aspect, all the existing technologies, or the ones which are forming and norming at this point in time, are more static in nature, right? Their construct is very static, whether it is fixed roles or long-lived entitlements or periodic compliance related retroactive certifications, right? But AI is demanding more dynamic access control, continuous monitoring, right? These are core principles of zero trust. And when you talk about the process and controls aspect of it, we are still antiquated in terms of how we are doing certifications, right? We are still relying on those compensating controls, right? And AI is not going to be, letting you do that in the next 1 or 2 years, because you're talking about just-in-time access. The access that is provisioned right when you need it. At the same time, there is persistent access. How are you going to tackle that? When you talk about the persistent access, an example, right, especially some of the AI modules require that access for, persistent memory and whatnot. How do I make sure that I can rotate those secrets? How do I make sure that, those are allowable, right? So that's when I think, in my opinion, the modernization has to have zero trust as a foundation with intent as the extra factor, right? You can talk about security, but you also have to talk about the intent of the transaction that has to be performed through the agent or non-agent and whatnot, right? So the modernization is going to be a little more centric towards ZT principles with intent as a backend.
Is talent shortage really real right now? Do you feel you are finding great talent?
I think there's something that's happening today that is a bit happening in a separate dimension to talent, which is the transformation into an AI native workforce.
Yeah.
So even the most talented team of software engineers, software development people, still have a same distribution of early adopters and late adopters. So somebody who 2 years ago might have been a director of software development, a star on the team, if they're not leaning into AI today, they're already falling behind. And that doesn't mean they're not amazing people and not amazing practitioners. It means they need to change. And all people have a dwell time for change. It doesn't happen overnight. So I think that is a huge challenge that I see with the workforce today, and that is a leadership challenge that I see with the workforce today, is how to help people realize the urgency in which they have to change, the urgency in which they have to transform. And for many people, this is extremely difficult. It's their identity. I had a extremely talented software developer that was pushing back on AI. I pushed harder and I convinced them to go into it. And after 3 weeks in, I did a checkup call, and they looked a little gloomy. And I asked what's going on. He said, look, this AI is amazing. I'm much more productive than I was before. But I lost my hobby.
Yeah.
Like, that was my passion. I loved doing it. I loved coding. I loved the craft. And now I'm managing 20 agents.
Yeah.
It's more effective, but it's not what I love. And
I don't need to debug. I used to enjoy debugging. Okay.
Where do you see this industry sort of headed?
That's a loaded question. So,
It is. Sorry.
I think back in 2020, I don't think we were talking about agents.
No. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that world is very new. But look, in a very large market like identity, I think we're just talking about how large A, the problem set, and B, thereby the opportunities to partner with organizations is, right? It's a very fairly large sort of opportunity set to work with. And so, I believe, look, identities are very fragmented and fractured. That's at least my point of view. You have IAM on the side, which is identity and access management. You have privilege access management, which is identity just behaving like a privileged user. And then you have all things like identity governance and so forth, right? So we've known about these three large markets and lots of, if I can call, small islands.
Yes. Adjacencies.
Adjacencies,
Yeah.
With identity security, posture management,
Verification.
IDV.
Yeah.
We were having that discussion in the morning.
Yeah.
ITDR.
Yeah.
Right? There's lots of small islands. But look, my point of view is, this is another thing that I think we got right in identity, which is identity is a horizontal fabric of an organization.
Yeah.
Identity is not a vertical fabric. And when you're a horizontal, you touch everything.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I believe thereby identity needs a platform, right? You cannot have an IAM, a PAM, an IG, an ISPM, an ITDR. This is way too complicated for organizations to manage.
Right.
6 tools, 6 UIs, that's never going to work. Thus, this partnership makes so much sense from a customer perspective. So, my belief is, look, there's a lot of consolidation that has to happen, both organic and inorganic. But I do believe the ultimate North Star is identity needs a control plane. It needs a platform where a identity verification or identity governance becomes apps on a platform, not necessarily a vertical pillar, if that makes sense. And that's what we want to go build. And I think we can.
And do you know the TAM for that platform? In my brain, the TAM for that platform, let's just say we are the enabler of a subset of that platform across the 3 dimensions I talked about earlier. The workloads that will take advantage of that core, in my brain, aren't just ServiceNow workloads. Right. They're also competing workloads. That's what I mean by collective defense. Right? If CrowdStrike is doing an attack path analysis and they believe that we have asset intelligence and fine-grained permissions intelligence and decision context intelligence that they don't have, I am super happy to enable their workloads that enable them to make money, so long as they also expose the goodies that we don't necessarily have access to our workload. So again, every workload that a CISO is taking advantage of is benefiting from the best possible, highest fidelity signal. That to me is the future direction of travel. And again, we just have to figure out how we create the right incentive structure for that vision to become a reality.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about what does trust look like in an agentic AI world based on an identity that is candidly probably outweighing non-human to human, so the number of non-human identities that we have? I think I saw the Palo Alto quote was 80 to 1 or something in terms of where we're starting to see non-identities go.
So I would say the question that you just asked this week is probably the number one asked question of every vendor, every CISO, everyone is thinking about this. Like if we take programmable logic, right? So the programmable is what? It's software. that software is being created. So now, and agents. And so now when you think about it, they will be figuring out a way to protect the code that's being written before it goes to lay down on top of the FPA, so that when it gets distributed out in every firewall that we have, that some agent doesn't automatically invoke and go do something bad, right? That started way back in when the software was developed at somebody's desktop, or laptop. So that whole concept of privileged access, identity management, and then using that from an agentic perspective as well. That was one of our announcements this week, was agentic scanning, to be able to go out and literally see everything that's happening from an agentic perspective, identify it, and say, hey, here's literally what's happening, because that's going to be the next bastion that we're all going to be looking at, and it's immediate because of AI speed right now. You don't have time. Like, this isn't, hey, we'll think about that in 6 months.
Pretty quickly when we start thinking about dystopian hallucinations, and when you start having people in an identity vault, the systems can hallucinate the privileged access that they have inside of the identities. And so there's a whole other world that's spinning up, that it's not just about user ID and password or someone snuck in behind someone. But when you start thinking about the hallucinations of agentic AI inside of something like an identity, the value of trust in what we think we know, I think is just going to grow exponentially, because people don't know back to the word trust, they don't know what to trust. And so as I listen to both of you describe, like, chip side, identity side, firewall side, we often see a lot of our clients where these groups don't talk to one another. Hardware's off doing their thing, identity's off doing their thing, SOC center's doing their thing. Maybe for the both of you, advice for people in the room thinking about, how do you tackle that when we have 3 different people who see 3 different problems? Not necessarily bad problems, they could all be good, but they're looking at it 3 different ways.
I tell CISOs to take the CFO out for dinner and scare them. I mean, I'm kidding, but not kidding, because that's the person that needs to know.
Yeah.
Like, the CFO is the one that ultimately holds the budget for how much you're going to spend. And they're going to challenge you on every nickel that you spend. Do you really need that? Do you really need that? Right? And you don't need it until you need it in your world, right? I always describe CISOs as the craziest. It's literally the craziest position that I've ever seen in my life. You guys are like riding unicycles, juggling sharp knives every day of your life, and you have to be right 100% of the time.
So if you had an audience with all the Fortune 500 CISOs right now, what would the 3 things you'd tell them to get ready for agentic AI?
Very, very simple, Patrick. As I mentioned, you have agents in your ecosystem.
Yeah.
You just don't know them. It might be running on a developer's laptop. It could be hidden on a Kubernetes cluster. So one, can you find and make sure that you find not, if you think about the agents, there are different types of agents. One would be, we call them as interactive agents. Don't stop your discovery just with that. The deeper analysis requires the agents running on your servers, on your compute layer. Make sure that you find them. That's first thing what they have to do. Second, treat agents as identities. So make sure you have a blueprint of how they're coming into your ecosystem, how they're getting terminated, and what access are you removing it once they have. So the entire, can you govern them, will be the second pillar. And the third one, which is the hardest one, which they have to solve, are they touching the systems and the data which they're supposed to, and in an appropriate manner? Not like what you have defined the access, but are they enforcing that access in real time? Just 3 questions. There's no other pillar which they should be looking at. These are the 3 things which matters from an identity lens.
That's great advice. So, asking you to predict the future now. Small ask. So what does the next 5 years look like, 3 to 5 years look like from an identity aspect with AI, but AI and the use of agentic, and what is going to be the difference of the companies that are successful and the companies that are not?
I think the only thing which will matter, one thing I will share with you is that the good sign what we learned from an identity perspective was that organizations took a very head start of making sure that identity is the cornerstone of these new identity class, which was a welcome change. A couple of years ago, when you look at non-human identities and human identities, it took them a while to move and realize that why identity is the cornerstone. I think no more you have to go and explain to the board that why identity is the cornerstone of this era. That battle I think we have won. Suddenly, identity is so hot, everybody is talking about it, which is a good sign. The thing what will matter for organizations is that are they designing everything in their agentic workflows with keeping identity at the center, number one. Number two, are they not trying to shoehorn or retrofit their existing models and trying to move to platforms which are future-proof, which can solve the needs of agentic era? And the third one is, are they looking at this entire thing holistically and not treating humans and non-humans and agents as three different types, but rather trying to solve that through a consolidated security offering, which is the right way to go.
So speaking of the loop, right, there's the talk about human in the loop, human on the loop. How do we navigate that with regards to visibility of what the agents and the platforms are doing when we need to give them automation to keep up and keep pace? I'll open that up to anybody, right? So.
I think that's foundational. Like the observability is foundational, but I think what has changed now is like the observability controls that we put for like traditional applications, right? It's primarily around the actions or the processes that are running on the technology stack, right? Yeah. Now that has to extend to the business process, right? And as we kind of adopt AI and we kind of roll out capabilities that are going to be tightly integrated with your business process, specifically anything that you are going to expose to your customer, you need to have some controls at the business process level, right? The technology controls themselves are not going to be adequate, at least like early stages of adoption. As you kind of rolling out new capabilities, you need to have those controls at the business process level with like your best humans watching it, right? Because that context was not that relevant for us, right? When it came to observability, now context is everything, right?
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with that. I have real example from last week where we saw in one customer that actually they are more mature in like with agentic workflows, and they have agents in their environment making 45,000 cloud API calls in 1 hour. And you think, I mean, it's not the human speed. It is difficult because it means that you have like on top of the agents and these loops that you have to build, you also need to monitor what's happening, and you need agents for that too, because there's no human who can actually monitor such that's like this type of activities. I think it's something that we have to keep in mind is like that when we move to this future, we have like there are new type of threats and there are new type of we'll see new type of incidents, and we have to be ready for that. And I mean, when you have these 45,000 API calls, you don't know if maybe there's a case where it's actually the agent is going rogue and trying to do, I mean, also something that we keep saying, I mean, when the agent can do something, the agent is trying to find maybe additional ways to access the database that it's trying to access, and it can wreak havoc in your environment. So I think that like for us, it's part of like what we need to try and think of how we also monitor these agents. We need agents for that, and how we reduce the risk that might come from these new processes.
I'm going to pivot and talk about on the defender side and the use of agents and getting to autonomy. How do we get to autonomy in the next 18 months? And what we've learned in building our agents is the internal term at Google for building quality into a system is called hill climbing. You just have to continuously climb the hill until you get to the quality you want. And what we're seeing, and as you're talking to people who are providing agentic capabilities, you should ask a few questions about how are they hill climbing to get to the quality that is needed to be able to then have the trust and confidence to be able to operate autonomously. And it's all about evaluation frameworks that exist, because it's not linear. Like the last mile is 60% grade, and you have to do that last mile to get there, and it's a long climb. So for the agents that we're releasing here and at Next, 80% of the work was not writing code. 80% was doing things in an evaluation framework that modified the prompts or did supervision or added a fine-tuning layer on top of the LLM itself so it could have specific context. And so that evaluation framework is critically important. And the operators now are going to start, instead of looking at things that the systems can handle, it's going to look at things that the systems have low confidence in and be able to, like, if it's just a simple case of, is this malicious or legitimate? And the system doesn't know, you might have to have 5 operators look at the same thing, because if one operator is wrong and it's training on that data, your receiver operator curve, your F score is going to go down dramatically if there's 0.001% error introduced in the system. And so you want that kind of redundancy. So how we're going to get there is going to be very different than what we do today. The evaluation frameworks that we're building for our agents are very similar to the evaluation frameworks that Waymo used to be able to build autonomy in cars. And so we know it can be done. We're just taking that body of science and knowledge and applying it to the cyber domain.